In 1834, a French archaeologist named Charles Texier rode into the highlands of central Anatolia looking for a lost Roman city. He never found it. What he found instead was so strange that, decades later, historians would still be arguing over what to make of it. Local villagers pointed him toward a stretch of hills near a place called Boazkoi and told him there were ruins there that belonged to nobody they knew. Not Roman, not Greek, older than both. Texier climbed up to see for himself, and what he found stopped him cold. A vast, fortified city carved into the hillside, its gates flanked by stone lions, its walls running for miles across the ridgeline. Scattered among the ruins were carved reliefs of men with long hair, no beards, and shoes with curled, upturned toes. A style that matched nothing from Egypt, nothing from Assyria, nothing from the Greek world Texier knew. And buried in the rubble of what had once been a royal archive, excavators would later uncover more than 10,000 clay tablets packed edge to edge with cuneiform, wedge-shaped writing borrowed from Mesopotamia, recording language after language, including one nobody had ever catalogued before. That language would turn out to be one of the oldest Indo-European tongues ever committed to writing, older by centuries than anything in Greek or Sanskrit. For a long time, nobody knew what to do with the discovery. There was a name that kept surfacing in old texts, dismissed for 2,000 years as belonging to a minor hill people, a handful of Old Testament verses, usually lumped in with other small Canaanite tribes, remembered mainly for selling Abraham a burial plot. 19th century historians had a tidy picture of the late Bronze Age. Three great powers shared the stage: Egypt on the Nile, the Mesopotamian giants of Assyria and Babylon, and Mycenaean Greece, immortalized by Homer. Texier's ruins fit nowhere in that picture. It took another 80 years of digging, and the eventual decipherment of that strange script in 1915, before scholars understood what they'd actually found. The capital of a fourth superpower, one that had once ruled a third of the ancient Near East, and then vanished so completely the world forgot it had existed. Its name was Hattusa. We call its people the Hittites. To understand how a footnote became an empire, you have to go back nearly 1,000 years before those tablets were written, to around 3000 BCE, when the Anatolian plateau was home to a native population called the Hattians, farmers and traders sitting on something the whole Bronze Age world wanted: copper and tin, the two metals that made bronze, the metal of weapons and status in a world before iron. Sometime near the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, a new group arrived from the north or east, speaking an Indo-European language unlike anything native to Anatolia, and bringing an unusual skill in horse breeding and chariot warfare. They settled first at a city called Kusera under a king named Pithana, and it was his son, Anita, who turned a modest hill kingdom into something with real teeth. Anita spent his reign picking off Hattian cities one by one, and when he reached a heavily fortified town called Hattusa, he didn't just conquer it, he erased it. By his own account, preserved on a tablet that survives today, he tore the city down, sowed its ruins with weeds, and cursed anyone who dared rebuild it. Whoever raised Hattusa from its ashes, he swore, would be struck down by the storm god himself. The curse held for about a century and a half. Then, around 1650 BCE, a king named Hattusili, sometimes called Labana, a title later Hittite kings would wear the way Roman emperors wore Caesar, built his capital on exactly the ground Anita had cursed. If the storm god objected, nobody wrote it down. His Hattusa would remain the heart of the Hittite world for the next 4.5 centuries. Hattusili didn't stop at rebuilding a cursed city. He looked south toward Syria, then the richest crossroads on earth, and started taking it apart, smashing through the fortified cities of Alalak and Urshu, and hauling their treasure home. He was unbeatable on a battlefield. Inside his own palace, he was not nearly so lucky. His sons turned on him in plot after plot for the succession, until the old king, out of trust in his own bloodline, passed the throne not to a son, but to his grandson. That grandson was Mursili I, and he inherited his grandfather's appetite for conquest, and then some. He finished the job in Syria first, razing Aleppo, and then attempted something almost nobody in the Bronze Age had tried. Marching his army 500 miles from the Anatolian highlands down to the gates of Babylon, the richest and most storied city on earth, home to the dynasty of Hammurabi. In 1595 BCE, Mursili's chariots reached a city with no idea an Anatolian army could travel that far, let alone arrive fighting fit, and Babylon fell in a single, stunning blow. A dynasty that had ruled for 300 years ended in an afternoon. Mursili looted the city and marched home a conqueror, and then, as if the gods really had been watching, was murdered in his own palace by his brother-in-law, a man named Hattusili, working with a fellow conspirator named Zidanta. What followed was decades of exactly the chaos that killing a king tends to produce. Hattusili took the throne, then was murdered himself. His killer didn't last either. For close to a century, the royal family effectively ate itself alive. Plots, assassinations, counter-assassinations. While outside the palace, enemies noticed the vacuum. The fierce Kaska tribes from the Black Sea Mountains and the rival kingdom of Mitanni both began carving away Hittite land until the conquerors of Babylon were struggling just to hold their own capital. It took a king named Telipinu, who seized power around 1525 BCE, to stop the bleeding, not with a sword, but with a document. Telipinu issued what's now called the Edict of Telipinu, one of the earliest known attempts anywhere to write down, in explicit legal terms, exactly who inherited the throne and in what order. It didn't end the empire's troubles, but it ended the killing, at least for a while. A Bronze Age constitutional fix for a Bronze Age succession crisis. If you're finding this as strange as I am, this is a good moment to hit subscribe. We're not even at the strangest part yet. The peace it brought didn't last. After Telipinu died, the kingdom drifted for the better part of a century, until a king named Superpower took the throne around 1350 BCE and found an empire that barely deserved the name. Hattusa burned, the royal family living in exile, enemies closing in from every direction. Most rulers handed a situation like that spend their reign playing defense. Superpower spent the next 20 years doing the opposite. Historians call him the Great Restorer, and it isn't an exaggeration. In 2 decades of relentless campaigning, he cleared Anatolia of its enemies, rebuilt Hattusa into a fortress nothing could crack, then turned on the powerful kingdom of Mitanni and struck so fast its king abandoned his own capital rather than face him. Hittite armies leveled the Mitanni capital, swept through Aleppo and Carchemish, and pushed to the Mediterranean coast. By the time Superpower was done, the empire was larger than it had ever been, secured the way any dynasty secures new ground, by installing his own sons as regional viceroys. It was while his army sat outside the besieged city of Carchemish that one of the strangest letters in the history of diplomacy reached his tent. It came from Egypt, from the widow of a young pharaoh, quite possibly Tutankhamun, who had died without an heir. Trapped and facing a powerful court official maneuvering to force her into marriage and take the throne himself, the queen did something no Egyptian royal had ever done. She wrote to the king of Egypt's enemies. Her husband had died, the letter said, and she had no son, but she'd heard the Hittite king had many. Send her one and she would marry him. He would rule as her husband and as pharaoh. She had no wish to marry a subject. She was afraid. Superpower was flawed. Egypt had spent centuries treating every foreign kingdom as beneath it, and here was an Egyptian queen offering a Hittite prince the throne of the pharaohs. Suspecting a trap, he sent an envoy to Egypt before answering. A year later, a second letter arrived, sharper this time. Why would she lie about something so humiliating, it asked. If she'd had a son of her own, would she really be begging a foreign king for a husband? She'd written to no one else. Send a son, and he would rule as pharaoh. That was enough. Suppiluliuma sent a son, a young prince named Zananza, south toward Egypt, toward what should have been one of the great unions in ancient history. Two mighty kingdoms joined by marriage instead of war. It never happened. Zananza was killed before he reached the Egyptian court, almost certainly by officials who had no intention of letting a foreign prince sit on the throne of the pharaohs, whatever the queen wanted. When word reached Suppiluliuma, he didn't send another envoy. He sent an army, tore through Egyptian-held territory in the Levant, and marched thousands of Egyptian prisoners of war back to Anatolia in payment for his son's murder. It was a victory that cost him everything. The prisoners carried something no general could have accounted for: tularemia, sometimes called rabbit fever, which spread through Hittite territory with terrifying speed once the captives arrived. Thousands died. Suppiluliuma himself, the man who had rebuilt an empire from ashes and humbled Mitanni and Egypt both, died of the same plague he had unknowingly brought home. His eldest son inherited the throne and died of it too, within a year. It fell to a younger son, Mursili II, to steady a kingdom reeling from plague and grief, and he did it well enough that by the time his own son, Muwatalli II, took the throne, the empire was strong again. Strong enough, in fact, to face down a new pharaoh determined to erase Hittite influence from Syria for good. Rameses II, remembered by history as Rameses the Great. His target was Kadesh, a crossroads city that controlled trade through the entire region. Take Kadesh, and Syria followed. In 1274 BCE, Rameses marched north with 4 divisions, named for the gods Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set, roughly 20,000 men in total. Muwatalli answered with a force nearly twice that size, drawn from across Anatolia and its allies, and built around thousands of heavy chariots. It's worth pausing on those chariots, because they tell you something about how differently the two armies fought. Egyptian chariots typically carried 2 men, a driver, and an archer. Hittite chariots carried 3, driver, spearman, and shield-bearer, trading speed for a punch that could break an infantry line outright. Muwatalli won the battle before it began, with a trick rather than a charge. He sent 2 spies disguised as deserters into the Egyptian camp, and when Ramesses' men captured and questioned them, they fed him exactly the lie Muwatalli wanted heard, that the Hittite army was still far north near Aleppo. Ramesses believed it, pushed ahead with only his lead division, and camped near Kadesh to plan his attack, with no idea the entire Hittite army was waiting on the far side of the city. The next morning, as he sat working out how he'd take it, roughly 2,500 Hittite chariots came pouring out of the trees along the Orontes River and tore through his camp in minutes. For a while it looked as though the pharaoh himself might be killed or captured, reduced to fighting with his own bodyguard as his army disintegrated around him, until a relief force arrived from the west and blunted the advance long enough for the rest of his army to regroup. The fighting dragged on all day, and by nightfall neither side had a clean win, though both would later claim one. Ramesses went home and had himself carved into temple walls as the hero who'd single-handedly turned the tide. Muwatalli made much the same claim in Anatolia. What actually happened is clearer from the aftermath than from either side's propaganda. Kadesh stayed Hittite, and it was the Egyptian army that eventually withdrew south. Rather than a defeat, Kadesh cost Egypt the war it was fought to win. Peace, when it came, arrived by an unusual route. A few years later, Muwatalli died, and his brother, Hattusili III, seized the throne from his own nephew in a short, bloody civil war. Whatever his methods, Hattusili was a shrewd statesman, and he recognized what Ramesses seems to have recognized too, that an endless war would eventually bankrupt them both, especially with a new rival, the rising Assyrian Empire, watching from the east. In 1259 BCE, the two kings signed a formal peace, the Treaty of Kadesh, sometimes called the Silver Treaty. It holds a genuine distinction in world history. The oldest surviving peace treaty, whose full text still exists, negotiated between two powers that had fought each other to a standstill, rather than one dictating terms to the other. A replica of the tablet hangs today at the United Nations headquarters in New York. With Egypt settled, the empire's western frontier along the Aegean told a different story. And it's here that Hittite history brushes against one of the most famous tales ever told. Records from the reign of Tudhaliya IV, who came after Hattusili III, refer repeatedly to a vassal kingdom called Wilusa and a rival power across the sea called Ahiawa. Modern scholars are fairly confident what those names mean. Wilusa is Troy. Ahiawa is the Mycenaean Greek world Homer would later immortalize in the Iliad. A treaty even survives between a Hittite king and a ruler of Wilusa named Alexandru, a name many historians believe is simply the Hittite rendering of Alexandros, Paris of Troy's other name in Homer's poem. The Trojan War likely wasn't pure legend. It may have been a real, if smaller and messier, conflict over a real city, one in which the Hittite Empire was a quiet but genuine stakeholder. It's worth pausing here on what this empire actually was underneath all the marching armies, because it's easy to lose that thread in a story told mostly through battles. Hittite law, preserved on hundreds of surviving tablets, was strikingly restrained by Bronze Age standards. Most offenses, even serious ones, were punished with fines and restitution rather than mutilation, a real contrast to the harsher codes next door in Mesopotamia. Hittite religion absorbed gods from every people it conquered or traded with, so enthusiastically that later inscriptions boast of the 1,000 gods of Hatti. And in at least one respect, the Hittites may have been ahead of their neighbors. A letter survives from a Hittite king turning down an Assyrian request for iron, explaining that good iron was scarce and production slow. Evidence that Hittite smiths were experimenting with iron-working centuries before the rest of the Near East made that leap, even if it never scaled up in time to save them. Whatever tension was building on the Aegean coast turned out to be the least of the empire's problems. Toward the end of the 13th century BCE, something happened across the entire eastern Mediterranean that no army, no treaty, and no royal edict could fix. Modern climate research, using tree rings and lake sediment, has identified a catastrophic drought that gripped Anatolia for at least 3 straight years, from around 1198 to 1196 BCE, and quite possibly longer. Fields that had once fed the whole empire failed. Famine spread. The crown was reduced to begging Egypt for emergency grain, and even that wasn't enough to stop people from starving. Hunger does something to societies that armies rarely manage alone. It breaks them from the inside while enemies are still gathering outside. Along the coastline, raiders' history knows only as the Sea Peoples, their true origins still debated. Whether displaced refugees, opportunists, or both, began striking coastal cities across the eastern Mediterranean, Hittite territory included. At the same time, the Kaska tribes, old enemies the Hittites had fought for 3 centuries, launched what would prove a final decisive push. Drought, famine, invasion, and internal revolt landed within the same narrow window of years, and around 1180 BCE, Hattusa, the city Anita had cursed, that Hattusili had defiantly rebuilt, that had once humbled Babylon and stared down the pharaohs, burned to the ground and was never rebuilt. The Hittites weren't unique in this. Historians call the period the Bronze Age collapse, and it wasn't confined to Anatolia. It swept through the Mycenaean palaces of Greece, the trading port of Ugarit in Syria, and shook even Egypt to its foundations, unraveling in a few decades an interconnected Bronze Age world that had taken centuries to build. Writing systems fell out of use, monumental buildings stopped. Trade routes that had linked the whole eastern Mediterranean simply vanished, and the region slid into what historians still call a dark age, one that lasted generations before anything like the old order returned. Hattusa's fall wasn't quite the end. Nobles and soldiers who survived fled southeast into Syria, into cities like Carchemish that had escaped the worst of it, and rebuilt small successor kingdoms there. States modern historians call the Neo-Hittites, who kept a version of Hittite language, art, and identity alive for another 4 centuries. These are almost certainly the Hittites the Old Testament remembers, the ones scholars for so long assumed were the whole story. But even these last outposts couldn't hold forever. As the Assyrian Empire rose to dominate the Near East, it swallowed the Neo-Hittite kingdoms one by one, and by the 8th century BCE, the last of them was gone. For 25 centuries after that, almost nothing remained of them beyond a handful of Bible verses about a minor tribe, until a Frenchman looking for a Roman ruin climbed the wrong hill in 1834 and found, buried under the weeds Anita had once sown out of spite, 10,000 tablets waiting to tell a very different story. If empires the world managed to forget and then had to dig back up are your kind of thing, stick around. Tell me in the comments what surprised you most about the Hittites, and subscribe so the next one finds you.